Here we have an introduction to the work of Karen Horney, who is a neo-analytic theorist who brings about the first of a feminist, we should say, perspective, as well as some different ideas on how we come to develop certain senses of self-loathing as we try to meet unattainable goals within ourselves. So neo-analysts were kind of opposed to Freudian, or I should say we're taking Freud's ideas to the next level. So Karen Horney was one of the early women in research at a time when not very many women went to college. It wasn't an option for very many people, but she did, and overall she was sort of a rebel. She was raised in kind of a high discipline family. Her father was this authoritarian ship captain, but because he was gone a lot, he wasn't able to throw the Bible at her too often. And her mother was sort of self-centered, narcissistic, and really despised her husband. So Karen Horney comes to us from this weird energy with her father and her mother. As a rebel, she attended grad school against her parents' wishes. She was one of only 60 women and 3,000 men. And she was sort of a party girl. She was popular, but she was also really smart. And she, published her first paper at a fairly young age. She was married to Oscar Horney. She was a student and he was working, and she did another thing that wasn't very common at that time. She got a divorce after having 3 daughters. And then later on, she had an affair with Erich Fromm, who we'll talk about a little later when we get to our humanitarian theorists, but they never did get married. And so she actually, Carl Abraham, you can think of him as related to these humanist psychologists, and she did get some of that psychoanalytic therapy, so she was involved in that. And one thing that she did that was quite wonderful is she treated her patients on a sliding scale, so she wasn't limited to treating only people who had the money. So in a nutshell, we'll talk about basic conflict in her model, security versus anxiety. We'll talk about some unhealthy solutions. She calls the self-effacing solution, the resignation solution, and the expansive solution. We'll talk about intrapsychic conflicts and self-hate, which I alluded to earlier, and the need to accept our real self as a healthy outcome, but that many of us tend to vacillate between our idealized and our despised self, leading to this self-loathing. And so she really thought therapeutically that we need to reintegrate the real self, which includes some despised factors and some ideal factors, to create acceptance of the real self. And once we get there, we'll have resolved a lot of problems. So she begins by talking about how children have this fundamental need for security. They need secure base, they need self-haven. In the attachment theorists will have talked about this. And so what does a child need for secure base? She needs to be able to explore, and that parent needs to be there being safe, kind of keeping an eye on things, watching, delighting, helping. And then the child also needs safe haven. When they fall out of this tree, they need to be able to go back to those safe, loving hands. So secure base to explore, safe haven to return to be for protection, for comfort, for delight, and to figure out various emotions. And so what do parents need in this model? They need to always be bigger, stronger, wiser, kind, whenever they can, to follow their child's needs, and if it's necessary, in the case of danger, to take charge. And so this is what would give about a nice, secure feeling in the child's acceptance of their real self. But unfortunately, many factors hinder these conditions. So many people just don't have that secure base, and she herself probably didn't if her mother was narcissistic. And so if we cross that off, what happens? Well, there can be a feeling of basic anxiety, which is the feeling of being isolated and helpless in a hostile world. That's an anxious feeling, especially for a child who's pretty vulnerable. And hostility then is a feeling that might emerge, sort of an anger that emerges from the realization that you're not secure, that you can't depend on your family. And we can't, if the child can't express that kind of hostility, then it would put them in a bad position, because if they express that, then they risk their secure base, and then they have more anxiety. And of course, as we saw kind of in the previous slide, this is produced by parents who make mistakes, but who make mistakes consistently, not a mistake here and there, but who are consistently indifferent or behave unpredictably, or who dominate, or who overprotect, or who isolate, or who show hostility. So there's a lot of things that parents can do that can bring about this feeling of anxiety, which can lead to this hostility, but the hostility can't be acted on because there's a risk to the comfort that a child needs. And so this leads to a neurotic, which is an unhealthy state. We don't really use that term anymore, which is this tension between anxiety and hostility, back and forth on this, and then this also in conflict with this need for security. And this can play out in other relationships, not just the parent-child relationship. And in a nutshell, the child wants to approach their parents. So on the one hand, they want to go get their parents to love and protect them. And on the other hand, they want to punish them. And so there is this tension that leads to neuroses. So what do? So we protect ourselves in 4 ways. First off is by affection. We try to get our people to love us. We give them all kinds of favors. We give them gifts. We do what they want them to do. We flatter them. But all of this doesn't yield authentic love. It doesn't get us what we need. That love is always conditioned on these gifts. Or we might submit. And it doesn't necessarily mean submitting to that parent, but if we just always give in, right? We submit to a religion maybe, or to our job, or to our boss, or even in a relationship to a dominant partner. So that's another way to protect themselves, assuming that this basic anxiety persists in the lifetime. Maybe you can see this in yourself. How do you get this sense of security from others? Do you use affection? Do you use submissiveness? Another way is through power. Dominating others, well, then we're not dominated. Or prestige, kind of along the same lines, a tendency to humiliate others, then we can't be humiliated. Or by owning a lot of things, that it keeps us away from poverty. So these are the first 3 defenses against anxiety. Or we can just withdraw. We can kind of step back from relationships, decide to be independent, detach ourselves emotionally. And sometimes when we do that, however, we also detach from our own real self. So these are 4 defenses that are laid out in your book a little bit. So the thing to remember is that each of these has a place at certain times. So there's a time for giving affection and gifts. There's a time for submitting. There's a time for demonstrating power, for taking charge, dominating, or for having, a possession. And there's a time for withdrawing and retreating to a safe space that's emotionally detached. And so we each kind of do each of these. As we saw, similar to what we saw in Adler's model. We use these appropriately, and if we do so, we use them when they're needed, then that's considered healthy. But sometimes people will gravitate kind of compulsively toward one strategy, and that means they've developed a neurosis in her view. So if we are just gravitating always toward this affection or always toward power, that's a neurotic state because it doesn't represent the necessary balance for good health. And so neurotic individuals develop these certain neurotic needs that are manifestations of their basic strategy. And so we'll look at 10 of those, what she considers neurotic needs that are persistent in a person's lives. So first off, we have to recognize that we do all have needs. We need to feel secure. And so we try to get our needs met. And so they only become neurotic when there's one-sided. They dominate our motivations and actions. And so the first is this neurotic need for affection and approval. It's always this person needs to have this approval, and they have a lot of anxiety without it. So they're always seeking to appease others and please others, meet others' expectations. Maybe this person is hypersensitive, doesn't take criticism well, or deals with anger poorly. And so that's one type of neurotic need. The neurotic need to restrict one's life within narrow borders. And so in this case, this person wouldn't be stepping out. They'd be afraid. They wouldn't be exploring. They never had safe base, so they just kind of close themselves off from the world and keep in a safe, sometimes solitary space. The neurotic need to exploit others. You can see that power dominating, and so they tend consistently to use others, to manipulate, to seek power, seek money, seek sex. So using other people, doing this all the time. Or a neurotic need for prestige, someone who's always seeking recognition, who maybe has this really heightened fear of embarrassment. They wouldn't want to be shamed. That would be a big deal to them. They're always saving face, and maybe they represent this prestige through their possessions. So they're kind of flamboyant. They have an ostentatious house or a lot of clothes that represent money, a car, so they're showing it off a bit. A neurotic need for personal achievement is a situation where someone is always trying to do better than. They're always having goals and going further and further, and if someone does something, they want to just kind of keep going further than that. And it might not be competing with other people. It might be just their own desire. It's never good enough. If they achieve one goal, they right away need to seek another goal. There can be a neurotic need for self-sufficiency or independence, like to never be able to get help from another, to always keep oneself distant and sort of aloof. Or a neurotic need for perfection and unassailability. They're always working on themselves. Any flaw that they have, they're trying to fix them. They're becoming perfect. They just have no room for any kind of imperfection or weakness in themselves. The neurotic need for power is often combined with this prestige and affection, but using other people. The neurotic need for personal admiration. They want very much for people to be sending accolades their way. They need other people to recognize what they're doing. And finally, the neurotic need for a powerful partner. So this person isn't seeking power themselves, but they want to be like with that powerful person. And so when they have a mix of people, they're going to glom onto the one who seems to have a lot of power. So these are all neurotic when they're used somewhat exclusively. And so normal adjustments, as we pointed out, we need a balance. Sometimes we find ourselves moving toward people, attaching, all right, finding friendship, finding groups, getting married, finding teams to work on. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes we find ourselves moving against people, like competing. This can be healthy competition, right? But we're trying to do better, but be the best at what we do and making our organization the best, so moving against. And sometimes moving away, distancing ourselves. Sometimes we can get too wrought up in things, like if you have a job where there's a lot of drama, sometimes it's good to kind of pull back a little bit, to be independent, self-sufficient, autonomous. So healthy will have a balance of these used at appropriate times depending on the situation. Unhealthy are these solutions that tend to dominate. And so if we're always moving toward, she calls it the self-effacing solution, the appeal of love or the compliant personality, just so much needs that approval from others. So the solutions always tend to be moving towards seeking attachment. This person alone feels weak, helpless, and maybe they feel sorry for themselves a little bit. Poor little me. They tend to diminish their own and always believe that others are superior, so they subordinate themselves, and that makes them kind of glom onto others, and someone who has a need for admiration might like that. They'll try hard to be liked and accepted, even against their own values. So their whole personality would be dependent on their situation and what it takes to be liked and accepted. And this will be a morbid dependency, like without a partner, they can't survive very well. They very much fall apart. Their need for love is very pronounced, and in fact, they only find self-worth in the relationship. Without a relationship, they have no innate value for themselves. And we might see a little bit of martyrdom, like someone who's always sacrificing what's in their best interest in order to take care of the family, take care of the partner, attend to other people's needs, and it's at their own expense and what their own personal goals and needs and attributes might be. So that's one solution that's considered neurotic. Another solution is the expansive solution, moving against. We call it the appeal of mastery or the aggressive personality. I guess these pictures are all showing the same thing, but this person, you're not going to challenge them because this is the kind of energy they're going to project back at you. So their primary solutions are moving against, and they might have a little bit of narcissism. They might be in love with not their true self, not their real self, but with an idealized version of themselves. This might happen because early in life, maybe their parents admired them too much. They might do very well, actually. They might have high standards and do very well at the things they seek to do. But when they do that, they're kind of self-righteous, patting themselves on the back. Once again, we might have had early kind of rigidity. Early, they might be rough or, kind of rigid in their take point, or they might have been parented in that way. And vindictive means they're taking revenge, and that revenge comes in sort of an arrogance, like a sense that they deserve better, and therefore they can be vindictive and get revenge on someone else. And boy, don't rub up against them, because they're going to hold on to that grudge and get what they think they deserve. They have a need to be right, to win, so they're not really open to changing their views. And along with that is this need for recognition and admiration. So too much of that is another unhealthy or neurotic solution. And the resignation solution is moving away. They're resigned, accepting that they're not going to have this love and security, and this freedom has a great appeal to them. This person is really detached. And so their solutions tend to be moving away, distancing oneself. Because they're resigned, excuse my voice here, let me get some water. Because they're sort of resigned to this fact that they can't get security from other people, it might lead to like a lack of striving. They're isolating themselves. They're not seeking to be involved in the world that's out there. They might have a big aversion to making an effort and change, so they just want to stay back, withdraw, be in their own little bubble, in their own little shell. They might tend to be really rebellious against constraints or influences, like they're not going to want anyone else to put them in boundaries. And they have this big desire for absolute freedom, which, we're human beings, it's not really possible. And as such, they're missing the emotional depth of life. And they tend to be what we call an onlooker. They're just watching. They're not emotionally involved. They're not getting involved in others. They're not striving to succeed. They're just keeping themselves separately. And they're separating themselves from their own emotional experiences as well, because the rich experiences of life tend to involve taking emotional chances. They do have a big need for privacy. You're not going to break easily into the shell of this particular person. So another neurotic solution if it's done too much. So this brings to these intrapsychic conflicts for very many people. And so each of us have our real self. It's our blueprint that would develop under ideal circumstances, which tends to include a little bit of strength and attributes, a little bit of things that aren't our best attribute, some successes and some failures, and we're able to accept all of these things in ourselves, if we're accepted. But many of us, especially those with tendency toward neurotic solutions, tend to hold in our minds a version of ourselves that isn't realistic. It's called idealized. It's a grandiose version of what we can be, like a perfect self, and which we can never actually achieve. And if we try too consistently to be our perfect self, we reject our real self. And so my example here is that self-effacing people those ones who are always moving toward, tend to think of their perfect, idealized self as being nothing but a composite of lovable qualities, always unselfish, always good, generous, humble, saintly, noble, sympathy. And it's not bad to strive for those attributes. But when you have in mind that that's who you should all the time be, you don't allow yourself any latitude. And whenever you fail, then you come into contact with this despised self, the one who fails to meet the idealized self goals. And when that happens, when you make even one small failure, if you're in this mindset of holding your idealized self up on a pedestal, then when you have one failure, which all of us do, you look at yourself as the worst scum. You just can't stand yourself. And a lot of people in this life are going back and forth between this idealized self, the time when they succeed at being the person they think they should be, and then they fall off the pedestal and they come to really hate themselves. And so in response to our own successes and failures, we can come to have this kind of vacillation. So the neurotic search for glory is what we just stated, this belief in this idealized self, perfect you, who, and your goals might be worthy, humble, noble, those are worthy goals. But when you believe in it, then it interferes with your ability to be human. So it's almost as if you are in a relationship. Some people get in a relationship with another person and they put that person on a pedestal. They think that person is perfect. And then when that person makes a mistake, well, it's easy to reject that person. But in this case, the one on the pedestal is oneself. And so you're putting yourself on a pedestal and falling in love with the idealized version of yourself who's perfect. All right. And then instead of actualizing yourself, accepting yourself as you really are, you're actualizing the idealized self and saying, that's the one I really am. That means that we run into problems, and I'll pause before I continue. These three elements that come into that are this need for perfection, which we can explain as the tyranny of the shoulds. This is how you should be. You should be that one on the pedestal. Forget about this one that's real, that has some, flaws here and there. This is how you should be. This leads to neurotic ambition. You're compulsively trying to be that person because that's who you think you should be. Not a bad thing to strive, but what becomes neurotic is this compulsive belief that that's who you are and that's who you should be, and anything else is a failure. And this drives toward this vindictive triumph that almost has a little bit of a vengeful piece. See, you didn't think I was good enough, but look, I am, right? And you can kind of see the parent-child dynamics playing out if the parents have underestimated the child, or if they felt ashamed or humiliated often as a child. And so this is kind of this neurotic search for glory, this perfect me that I should always be. So what happens when these three selves conflict? Well, first off, if we're healthy, we have this acceptance of our real self. And as we grow and mature, we come to self-realization. We have that little bit of humor about ourselves. We've just accepted ourselves as we are. Doesn't mean we don't have goals, but it's realistic. All right. But the tyranny of shoulds leads to these impossible internalized expectations. This neurotic pride in something that you've done isn't necessarily a bad thing if you've done good work. But taking pride in false attributes of the idealized self, which aren't true, that was just like an event or an occurrence, but your idealized self can never be, and that leads you to not accept this real self, no confidence in the real person. And so if you can't be perfect in the morning, well, maybe you'd rather stay home sick than show that less than perfect persona. And this is a really tenuous kind of pride, because as soon as you have a failing, then what's going to wake up but that despised self, the one that you dislike? And all of this leads to what she calls self-hatred or self-loathing. That's the outcome of neurotic pride, is a hatred of the real self, the one who's flawed. This vacillation going back and forth between this idealized self, see, I am smart, I am good, I am this perfect person, versus the despised self, the one who doesn't make it. That's the nature of neurotic pride. And so how does self-hatred play out? Well, first off, it involves having a sense of relentless demands on the self. You're always pushing. This person is never relaxed, and even when they're successful, they're still demanding things of themselves. There's no ease. Merciless self-accusation. They have deep down feelings of being an imposter, a fraud, being not good enough, that they're just acting. Whenever they have virtues, they're always questioning them and feeling like someone's going to see through them because they themselves see themselves as not good enough. This leads to self-contempt, this negative voice. If you hear the self-talk that a person does, this person is just very, very unkind in their voice to themselves. Speaking to themselves, they might say things like, "You are so persistently, deadenly stupid to lose your phone again, you idiot." This person would never likely speak to another person that way, but to themselves, they're just brutal. Self-frustration. They might deny themselves pleasurable activities. They're maybe always focused on those goals, so they're never just, taking pleasure in the moment. They can even torment themselves, be so unkind, like causing physical pain, stabbing themselves with a knife, cutting off all their hair, being very cruel to themselves, intentionally causing pain for themselves, even in psychological ways too, putting themselves in positions where pain is the only outcome. May have self-destructive actions that are less direct, like overeating, like using drugs, like sacrificing sleep to work too hard all the time, having promiscuous sex, which maybe leads to them feeling degraded or getting disease, or leading them to a breakup. So all of these kinds of things. So in therapy, Karen Horney would say that we need to have therapeutic goals. So patients have to be taught to live with the real self, accepting that sometimes they're going to be, doing great, sometimes not great, that process, that things are always uncertain, and that they have to be present in the moment, knowing that their real self will know what to do and be able to do it. They have to accept that this acceptance of the real self is a lifelong process, and that it'll be something that they're always, always going to have to be aware of, and knowing that they're limited, like they can't be that perfect person. They have to give up the search for glory and settle for a less exalted but much happier existence. They have to learn self-compassion, being kind to oneself. And quoting Horney, her hope is that all patients will feel sympathetic toward themselves and experience themselves as being neither particularly wonderful nor despicable, but just as the struggling and often harassed human beings that they are. In other words, treating themselves in the way they might treat a friend, a little good, a little bad, doing the best they can. But this is really tough to resolve, because you don't want to give up that idealized self, the one who achieved some glory, the one who maybe had some adulation. It's hard to give up on that ideal, even after a long time in therapy. And in fact, someone who has this kind of vacillation might, in fact, look down on other people for not striving hard enough. They might have to drive themselves in what they consider to be healthy ways, but that's actually being that neurotic, seeking for glory. And they might continue to rage at themselves when they realize they'll always have imperfections. So accepting the imperfect one can be really hard. You might imagine that being in a relationship with a person like this would also be hard, because they would tend to be just as hard on their partners, just as it may be lacking in compassion, not toward people in general, but to those who they have taken on as partners. And we've got a little case that we'll be working with this week. I won't go through it now because we're going to go through it in class, but we'll take a look at this case when we get to that.